When 72-year-old Harold James Brennan and his 68-year-old wife, Margaret Rose, were betrayed by the 5 children they had raised and sacrificed everything for, and left to die like beggars under the Queensborough Bridge in New Product, York. They had no idea that the son they'd given up for adoption 38 years ago had become Xavier Sterling Knight, one of the most feared Mafia bosses on the East Coast, and he'd been searching for them for 15 years. This elderly couple had worked themselves to the bone for 4 decades, Harold as a carpenter and Margaret in a textile factory, giving their 5 children, Brandon, Tyler, Chelsea, Amber, and Travis, every opportunity they never had. But when those children became successful, they grew ashamed of their poor parents and cruelly cast them out to sell their childhood home for profit. What Harold and Margaret never told their 5 children was that, 38 years ago, long before their lives were stable, they had been blessed with a baby boy, but the crushing poverty and social pressure of that time forced them to give that newborn away together, a secret they buried for nearly 4 decades, until fate brought him back in the most unexpected way. Enter Jade Amelia Winters, a 27-year-old woman with haunted green eyes who worked 3 jobs just to survive. And when she found the elderly couple freezing on the streets, she gave them her last $20 and a place to sleep, despite barely having enough for herself. Because Jade understood abandonment, she'd lost her own 3-year-old daughter and survived years of brutal abuse at the hands of a monster. But here's where the story takes a shocking turn. Because 5 years ago, Xavier killed that monster, Dmitry Volkov, a rival Russian mob boss who happened to be Jade's husband, in a bloody gang war that accidentally freed her from a living hell. And neither Xavier nor Jade realized their paths had crossed in blood and violence long before they met again. When Xavier discovers that the fragile woman who saved his parents is connected to his darkest hour, and when his 5 siblings learn that the terrifying Mafia boss protecting their parents is the brother they never knew existed, everything they thought they knew about family, loyalty, and redemption will be shattered. If you want to know what happens when Xavier's past collides with his present, hit that like button, share this story, and subscribe because you won't believe what happens next. But the real question is, when a powerful enemy from Xavier's world discovers his weakness and comes for the 3 people he's finally learned to love, will he choose his criminal empire or the family he spent his entire life searching for? A November night in Queens was cold enough to numb the bones. A thin drizzle kept falling over dark streets piled with trash and broken dreams. And it was in that night, when a glossy black Rolls-Royce Phantom slid through the poor neighborhood like a luxurious ghost drifting through ruin, that Xavier Sterling Knight saw something that made the hand on his steering wheel tighten with a strange sensation he couldn't explain. Outside a grocery store that had been closed for a long time, 3 figures were huddled beneath a narrow awning, 2 elderly people with soaked, ragged clothes and a thin young woman trying to shield them with her flimsy coat. But it wasn't the poverty that made Xavier stop. It was the 3 thugs standing in front of them with cruel smiles. The leader, a hulking guy in a drenched hoodie, was gripping Harold by the collar, his voice slicing through the rainy night like the growl of a wild animal. "Old man, I know you still have a few bucks in your pocket. Hand it over if you don't want your wife to get hurt." While the second thug was pinning Margaret's arms down despite her weak cries, the third, a pimply-faced kid, lunged forward to grab Jade's hair until she suddenly stepped between them, her voice shaking but firm. "Let them go. I'll give you money. Everything I've got." Xavier killed the engine and stepped out in a black Armani suit without a single wrinkle. Rain dotted his shoulders, but he didn't care. His cold blue eyes locked onto the 3 thugs with a lethal calm that anyone in the underworld would recognize instantly. But these 3, stupid men who only knew how to bully the weak, had no concept of the death walking toward them 1 step at a time. He didn't say a word. No warning. Xavier needed only 2 seconds to close the distance, seize the right arm of the leader still clutching Harold's collar, and twist. It was a lightning snap, and the crack of bone rang out cleanly in the night, the man's scream drowning even the rain. Before the other 2 could react, before their small brains could even register what was happening, Xavier let the leader drop to the pavement like a bag of garbage, then swept his gaze to the remaining 2, with a wordless message so clear it was terrifying. Run or die. They chose to run, leaving the leader behind as he clutched his broken arm and sobbed. And that leader, after meeting Xavier's eyes with their absolute lack of emotion, also dragged himself away in agony and total panic, leaving a smear of rainwater and blood on the freezing sidewalk. Jade stood frozen, her heart pounding as if it wanted to tear out of her chest, staring at this stranger with horror tangled with another strange feeling she didn't dare name, while Harold and Margaret clung to each other, trembling, not knowing whether to fear or thank the man who had saved them with such frightening brutality. Xavier turned back, and for the first time he looked straight into Jade's haunting green eyes, then down at the two elderly people shaking uncontrollably, and something in his chest, something he'd thought had died long ago, suddenly stabbed with pain. His voice was cold but precise. "My name is Xavier Knight. I need people to take care of my penthouse in Manhattan. The two elderly ones will do light work. Pay is $5,000 a week. Private luxury accommodations, full meals, free medical care." He looked at Jade. "And you'll be their primary caretaker. Pay is $8,000 a week, all expenses covered." Jade took a step back. The instinctive wariness she had from years of Dimitri's abuse wouldn't let her trust any man, especially a man who had broken someone's arm in 2 seconds without blinking, and her voice trembled. "Why are you helping us? What do you want from us?" But before Xavier could answer, Margaret suddenly collapsed, her weak legs finally giving out under the cold and the fear. Harold cried out, "Margaret!" then turned to Jade. "Jade, please help her." Jade had no time left for doubt. She rushed forward and lifted Margaret up, feeling the woman's body was ice cold, and when she looked up at Xavier with desperate eyes, he was already there. He scooped Margaret into his arms as gently as if she weighed no more than a child, and walked toward the Rolls-Royce, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. "Get in the car, all three of you. The hospital, or my penthouse. You've got 10 seconds to decide, but if you let her die out of pride, I won't forgive you." Harold looked at his wife shivering in the stranger's arms, looked at Jade with pleading eyes, and Jade, who had been forced to choose between pride and survival too many times, gave a small nod, her voice thick. "We'll go." Not because she trusted him, not because she hoped, but because in the cold rain of Queens, they had no other choice. The Rolls-Royce glided from Queens to Manhattan, as if it were moving between two different worlds. One side, a desperate poverty of aging buildings and dim streetlights. The other, a skyline of glittering towers, as if money could erase every shadow. In the back seat, with its soft, luxurious leather, Jade held Margaret close while she shivered, and Harold sat beside them, not daring to look at the cold face of Xavier in the front. No one spoke for the entire 20-minute drive. There was only the quiet hum of the engine, and the ragged breathing of three people trying to understand what kind of world they had just stepped into. When the car stopped in front of Knight Tower, a sleek black glass building rising 45 stories, a bright gold K logo blazing at the main gate, a tall man of about 42 in a gray suit with a stern face was already waiting at the entrance. Xavier gave a single nod, and the man stepped forward to open the car door, his voice low and warm but threaded with authority. "Boss, everything's been prepared as you asked. Dr. Sinclair is waiting upstairs." This was Jasper Cohen, the man everyone called Jax, Xavier's right hand for 15 years, a man who had witnessed countless deaths and still kept a thin strand of humanity in his dark brown eyes. When he looked at the three new guests with quiet curiosity, Jade felt that unlike Xavier, whose gaze was ice, this man still knew how to see other people as human beings instead of objects. The private elevator reserved for the penthouse rose smoothly to the 45th floor, in a silence so thick it felt suffocating, and when the doors opened, Jade had to close her eyes for a second because she couldn't believe what she was seeing. A 500-square-meter apartment spread out before her with 4-meter ceilings, gleaming white marble floors, and floor-to-ceiling glass that looked straight over Central Park, sparkling with night lights. Modern furnishings filled the space, a white leather sofa, a polished mahogany table, expensive art on the walls, and it made her feel like she had stepped into an architecture magazine instead of reality. Harold and Margaret stood motionless, their calloused hands not daring to touch anything, their eyes sweeping the place with the stunned disbelief of people who had been pulled out of hell and dropped into heaven without understanding why. Margaret whispered, trembling, "Lord, is this a dream?" Her voice was so small only Jade could hear it. Jax led them across the vast living room and pointed to a room on the west wing. "This is Mr. and Mrs. Brennan's room. King-size bed, fully stocked closet, private bathroom with a massage tub, automatic climate control, and windows facing the Hudson River." He opened the door to show them a bedroom Harold and Margaret would have never dared to dream of even in the best days of their lives. A soft bed with crisp white sheets, a plush fur rug, and the faint scent of lavender hanging in the air. Margaret began to cry, her shaking hands covering her mouth. Harold held her tighter, and Jade had to turn her face away because she didn't want them to see the tears spilling from her green eyes. But Jack saw anyway, and his gaze softened a little as he said, "Your room is here. Smaller, but comfortable." He led Jade to a room on the east wing, truly much smaller than the elderly couple's, yet still twice the size of the damp basement apartment she'd lived in for the past 2 years. It had a clean, single bed, a small desk, and a window looking out over the glittering city. There was no time to stay stunned for long because a woman of about 32 appeared, wearing a white blouse with blonde hair neatly pinned up, carrying a medical case, her smile professional but warm. "I'm Dr. Freya Sinclair. Xavier asked me to check on your health." Over the next half hour, she carefully checked Harold and Margaret's blood pressure, heart rate, and temperature, prescribed medication for his heart condition and her arthritis, and explained in detail the nutrition and rest they needed. Everything was free. Everything was paid for by Xavier. When Dr. Freya left, Xavier appeared in the living room, standing at the tall window looking out over the city, his silhouette in a black suit like a dark king gazing down at his kingdom, and his cold voice carried through the air. "I have 4 rules you must follow without exception. First, you don't leave this penthouse without my permission. Second, you don't ask about my work no matter what you see or hear. Third, you never step into my private office in the North Wing. Fourth, any needs from food to clothing go through Jack's. No one contacts me directly unless I allow it." Jade swallowed, feeling as if she were inside a golden cage, luxurious but still a cage. But when she thought of the 2 elderly people trembling beside her, she nodded. "We understand." Xavier turned and looked straight into her eyes for the second time that night. His cold blue gaze seemed to want to pierce through her soul, and then he walked away into the North Wing without another word. When Xavier disappeared behind the door of his private office, Jax let out a quiet sigh and turned to Jade, his voice lower, more serious. "I need to speak with you alone." He led her out onto the large balcony where the November wind tore at her hair, and under the city lights, Jax looked at Jade with worried eyes. "You need to understand that Xavier isn't a good man. He's one of the most dangerous men on the East Coast. He has countless enemies who want him dead, and anyone near him becomes a target. That's why those rules exist. Not to imprison you, but to protect you from people who wouldn't hesitate to torture an old woman or kill an innocent girl just to hurt Xavier." Jax's voice trembled slightly as he went on. "There's a man named Anatoly Petrov, a Russian Mafia boss, trying to destroy everything Xavier's built, and if he learns you exist, you won't live through the night." And Jade, who had lived with a monster before, who knew the sound of violence and the taste of death, looked into Jax's eyes and saw the terrible truth there. They had escaped one hell only to step into another. The only difference was that this hell had marble floors and a view of Central Park. On the first night in a room that was luxurious yet unfamiliar, Jade lay on a soft bed she'd never once experienced in all 27 years of her life, staring up at the high ceiling while faint city light seeped through the window and painted strange shapes across it. And even though her body was exhausted from 3 back-to-back jobs and the horror of tonight, her mind couldn't stop circling the man who had saved them with brutality so chilling it made her skin crawl. The way he'd broken someone's arm as if snapping a dry branch. The cold blue eyes that held no emotion as they watched another person's pain. At 2 o'clock in the morning, when sleep still wouldn't come, Jade sat up and pulled out her old phone with its cracked screen from the pocket of her damp jacket that had finally dried. With shaking hands, she opened the browser and typed, letter by letter, Xavier Sterling Knight, then hit search with a heart pounding like a drum. What appeared on the screen made the blood in her body feel like it froze. Hundreds of articles with horrifying headlines. Xavier Knight, the mysterious mafia boss of the Knight Syndicate. 47 murders never proven. The most dangerous man on the East Coast. And blurry photos taken from a distance of a man in a black suit stepping out of buildings, his face always swallowed by shadow. Jade recognized him instantly. The man was only a few walls away. Her fingers trembled as she scrolled, reading line after line as her terror rose. About bloody gang purges, about legitimate businesses masking illegal operations, about whispered rumors that Xavier Knight could erase a family in a single night, and no one would dare investigate. And when she was about to shut the phone off because she couldn't take any more, an article from 5 years ago surfaced with a title that made time stop. Russian Mafia boss Dmitry Volkov killed in a Brooklyn shootout. The air in the room seemed to get sucked out. Jade stared at that name. Dmitry Volkov. The name that had become a nightmare through 4 years of her personal hell, and her hand shook so badly she could barely tap the link. It opened to photos of a blood-soaked scene with blurred sections, and one image showed a tall man in a black suit leaving the area. His face turned away, but Jade knew exactly who it was. The phone slipped from her hand onto the plush carpet with a small sound. Her heart hammered so hard she thought she might pass out. And suddenly, without permission, the memory from 5 years ago came crashing back like a tidal wave that tore through everything in its path. She was back in the damp, lightless basement of the house in Brighton Beach, her belly swollen at 7 months, the baby inside giving weak kicks, her wrist chained to a rusted pipe. Dmitry had locked her down there for 3 days because she dared to look another man in the eye at a party. No food, no water, only darkness and the scurry of rats. That night, she heard gunshots upstairs. 1, 2, 10. Like a war erupting right above her head. Shouts in Russian and English. Furniture smashing. Then silence. A silence so terrifying she thought she'd gone deaf. She waited. She didn't know how long, minutes or hours, until she couldn't hear anything at all. And with the last strength of a desperate woman, she pulled at the chain until her skin split and blood ran, slipped her hand free, and crawled up the stairs with her heavy, pregnant body, pushing the basement door open. The house looked like hell on earth. Dmitry's guards lay scattered in death, blood soaking into an expensive Persian rug, and in the middle of the living room, Dmitry lay on his back in a pool of blood, with a bullet hole right between his brows. The cold blue eyes that had beaten her now stared lifelessly at the ceiling. Jade stood there barefoot, stepping into warm blood, looking at the face of the monster who had stolen 4 years of her life. And what she felt wasn't grief. It wasn't fear. It was relief so intense it stole her breath. But her body didn't grant her time to feel it. Pain tore through her abdomen like a knife. Her water broke, soaking her filthy clothes. She collapsed beside Dmitry's corpse, screaming, alone in a house full of bodies, and delivered her tiny, fragile baby girl 2 months early. And when neighbors finally dared to call the police, when the ambulance came, Jade had already passed out with the baby in her arms, never knowing that 5 years later fate would bring her face to face with the very man who had killed Dmitry that night. Back in the present, Jade sat on the floor of the luxurious room, arms wrapped around her knees, trembling not from fear but from a knot of feelings she couldn't untangle. She should have been afraid of Xavier. She should have hated him for killing her husband, even if that marriage had been a living hell. But instead, all she felt was a strange relief, as if the universe had arranged for the man who had freed her 5 years ago to appear and save her again, and she didn't know whether she should trust this cruel pattern of fate or run before it was too late. Yet when she thought of Harold and Margaret sleeping peacefully in the next room for the first time in weeks, she knew she couldn't leave. She couldn't abandon them, not even if the man protecting them was one of the most dangerous killers in New York City. 2 months passed like a strange dream that none of the 3 of them dared to believe could last, and in that short stretch of time, the penthouse on the 45th floor slowly shifted from an unfamiliar golden cage into something that almost resembled the word home, a word they hadn't had in so many years. Harold, his health noticeably improved thanks to expensive medication and a full nutrition plan that Dr. Freya monitored every week, found his way back to an old joy in woodworking, and every morning when sunlight spilled across the wide balcony overlooking Central Park, he sat there with the simple tools Jax had bought for him, gently shaping pieces of wood into small animals, delicate boxes, his 72-year-old hands trembling but still skilled, his eyes lit with the pure pleasure of a craftsman doing what he loved. Margaret, the 68-year-old woman who had once washed dishes for hire and begged on the streets, now found meaning in making warm family meals, and each afternoon the scent of chicken soup, homemade bread, and traditional apple pie drifted through the penthouse. She hummed quiet hymns as she stirred the pot, and when Harold and Jade sat down at the table, she smiled with the pride of a mother feeding her family, even if this family had been formed through the strangest of circumstances. Jade had become a devoted caregiver. Every morning at 7 o'clock, she woke to check Harold's blood pressure with a modern electronic monitor, made sure he took the right heart medication at the right time, gave Margaret her bone supplement and anti-inflammatory pills for her arthritis, then read to them on rainy afternoons when they couldn't go out to the balcony, her voice gentle as she moved from classic novels to current news. And in those calm moments, with Harold carving wood, Margaret knitting, and Jade reading aloud, They looked so much like a real family that sometimes all three of them forgot they were living on the charity of a mafia boss. The couple began to see Jade not as a paid caretaker, but as the daughter they'd never had. Margaret often stroked Jade's hair when she sat beside her, calling her sweetheart in a voice full of tenderness. Harold would brush Jade's shoulder as he passed, giving her a small nod of gratitude. And Jade, who had lost her parents at 16, felt a piece of her emptiness fill in a little, even though she knew it could all vanish at any moment. One night near the end of January, when the season's first snow turned Manhattan white beyond the windows and Harold was asleep in his room, Margaret and Jade sat together on the white leather sofa with 2 cups of hot tea, the glow of the electric fireplace wrapping the room in warmth. And Margaret said casually, "You know, you look like the son I lost." Her voice trembled as she said it, and Jade turned to her with curious green eyes. Margaret stared into her tea as tears slid down her aged, wrinkled face. "When I was 30, long before Harold and I had any stability in our lives, we were blessed with a baby boy. We were so drowning in poverty that we couldn't even pay rent. We had no steady work, and both our families had cut us off out of shame." She wiped her tears with the rough back of her hand. "I had to give my baby up a few days after he was born. I left him at the church door with a note that had his name and date of birth, hoping a good family would take him in, and I never stopped thinking about him. Every day, every year, wondering if he was healthy, if he was happy, if he's still alive now. He'd be almost 40. Jade felt her heart tighten with Margaret's pain. She set her cup down and wrapped her arms around her, letting Margaret cry into her shoulder as she whispered, "You did everything you could. You made the hardest decision of your life so he'd have a better chance. That's the highest kind of love a mother can give." And the 2 women held each other and cried in silence, one grieving a child lost, the other grieving a child dead, both unaware that the son Margaret was mourning was only a few walls away, in the dark office of the North Wing, where Xavier Sterling Knight stood by the window looking down at the city with a glass of whiskey in his hand, not knowing that the mother who'd abandoned him 38 years ago was crying for him just beyond the door. That night, after Margaret had fallen fully asleep in Harold's arms, Jade lay on her bed and still couldn't close her eyes because the sound of his dry cough carried through the thin wall, a deep cough from somewhere inside his chest that made her worry, even though Dr. Freya had said it was only a symptom of chronic lung disease from years of smoking. She decided to sit up anyway, slip on a thin robe, and step into the living room to make warm honey tea for him to drink when he woke coughing again. 2 o'clock in the morning, the penthouse was drowned in darkness, lit only by the faint glow of the city outside. Jade sat on the sofa with the mug in her hands, staring out at the tall window where the snow kept falling in silence. And then the private elevator opened with a small sound that made her flinch and turn. Xavier stepped out, and Jade knew immediately something was wrong. His black Armani suit was soaked, not with snow but with blood. Blood streamed from his left shoulder, soaking through his white shirt until it was stained red. His face was pale under the dim light, yet his blue eyes were still cold and alert when they landed on her. The instinct of a woman who'd had to care for her own wounds after Dimitri's beatings surged up. Jade set the tea down and hurried toward him, not thinking about Rule 3, not thinking about who he was or what he'd done, only seeing someone bleeding too much. Her voice was tight with alarm. "You're hurt. We need to call a doctor right now." But when she reached out to steady him, Xavier shoved her back with a sharp movement, his voice like ice. "Don't touch me." Jade stepped back, but she didn't retreat. Her green eyes locked on his cold blue ones without fear. "That's a gunshot wound in your shoulder. If you don't bandage it now, you'll lose blood. And if you die, who takes care of Harold and Margaret? Who pays me? Who protects us from Anatoly Petrov, the one Jax warned about?" The blunt, practical chill in her words seemed to slip through Xavier's armor. And for the first time that night, something like surprise flashed in his eyes. He studied her for a long moment, weighing her, deciding, then gave a slow nod, stepped to the sofa, and sat down, peeling off his suit jacket with stiff movements driven by pain. Jade rushed to the bathroom for the large first aid kit Dr. Freya had left, clean towels, warm water, then returned and dropped to her knees in front of him with her heart pounding. When she cut away Xavier's blood-soaked shirt, the wound showed clearly, a clean pass through his left shoulder. The bullet had gone through without hitting bone, but it was still bleeding heavily, and when her fingers touched his skin to wipe the blood away, both of them felt it, a jolt like electricity, and the air between them suddenly grew heavy and tight, hard to breathe. Jade forced herself to focus on the bandaging, Her small hands were steady and skilled as she cleaned the blood, sprinkled antibiotic powder, wrapped the gauze firm but not too tight, careful not to do more damage. Through all of it, Xavier didn't let out a single sound even though she knew it hurt. He only sat still, watching the crown of her head with a strange look he didn't understand himself. When she finished, Jade leaned back, her hands still faintly trembling, and Xavier asked in a low voice, "You aren't afraid of me?" It was a simple question, but it carried too much underneath. Jade met his eyes and answered with a calm that was almost frightening. "I already died once, sir. There's nothing left to be afraid of." Xavier frowned. "How did you die?" he asked, not out of curiosity, but out of something deeper he didn't have a name for. Jade let out a slow breath and looked down at her hands, still smeared with his blood. "My daughter died 2 years ago. She was only 3. A congenital heart condition. I didn't have the money to save her, and when she died in my arms, part of me died with her." The room went so still it felt dangerous. Only the soft fall of snow outside the glass and the sound of their breathing. Xavier looked at this thin woman with a feeling he'd never known in all 38 years of his life. Something that felt like empathy, like understanding, and for the first time since he'd been a child in an orphanage, the coldness in his eyes loosened, just a little. He didn't speak. He didn't comfort her or promise anything. But the way he looked at Jade shifted, from a meaningless stranger to someone who understood what it meant to lose. And when Jade stood to leave, he said quietly, "Thank you." 2 simple words that people in the underworld rarely ever heard from Xavier Sterling Knight. Jade turned and looked at him one last time before she disappeared into the darkness, leaving him sitting alone with his shoulder wrapped in fresh bandages and a heart beginning to feel something other than cold. 3 days after the night, Jade bandaged Xavier's wound. When his shoulder had begun to heal thanks to strong antibiotics and Dr. Freya's professional care, his phone rang at 8 o'clock in the evening while he was sitting in his private office on the 42nd floor of Night Tower, looking out over Manhattan drowned in night, millions of lights scattered like stars fallen to earth. And when he saw the name Regina Hawthorne on the screen, his heart began to beat faster in a way that felt abnormal. Regina's voice came through the speaker, trembling. This 45-year-old woman had worked as a private investigator for 20 years, and she had never heard her own voice shake like this when calling a client. "Mr. Knight, I have the DNA results." She paused as if she had to gather courage. "I compared the hair sample you provided with the hair samples from Mr. Harold Brennan and Mrs. Margaret Brennan taken from the brush in their bathroom, as you requested. And the result is..." Her voice caught. 99.7% match, Mr. Knight. They're your biological parents. There's no doubt." Xavier stood still as stone. The phone clenched in his hand so tightly his knuckles went white, staring at the window without truly seeing anything. 15 years. 15 years of searching through countless investigators, millions of dollars spent, thousands of records checked, and in the end, the people he'd been looking for were living inside his own penthouse, rescued by him on a rainy November night. His voice came out rough, rare when he answered. "You're sure?" Regina let out a breath. "I checked 3 times with 2 different labs. They all came back the same. Margaret Rose Brennan, born 1957, and Harold James Brennan, born 1953, are your biological parents. You were born when Margaret was 30, in 1987, at St. Mary Hospital in Boston, and you were brought to Holy Cross Orphanage 2 days later." Xavier ended the call without another word, let the phone drop onto the mahogany desk with a small sound, braced both hands on the tabletop, lowered his head, and felt his shoulders shake, not with tears, but with the pressure of 38 years finally breaking open. Jax walked into the office without knocking. He'd known his boss long enough to sense when something serious had happened, and when he saw Xavier standing like that, Jax understood immediately. "Boss, that was Regina, wasn't it?" His voice was gentle, like he was speaking to a wounded animal. Xavier nodded slowly, his throat thick. "They're my parents, Jax. The old couple I saved, the ones I put in the penthouse, they're my biological parents." Jax went quiet for a long time, then asked the only question that mattered. "Do you want to tell them right now?" Xavier lifted his head. His blue eyes were rimmed red, but there were no tears. "Not yet. I need time. I need to know what kind of people they are before I decide whether they should know. They abandoned me once. I need to be sure that..." He didn't finish, but Jax understood. Xavier was afraid of being rejected again. afraid that if they learned their son was a murderous mafia boss, they'd recoil in disgust and turn their backs. From that night on, Xavier changed. He stopped avoiding the penthouse the way he had before and began spending more time there, sitting in silence on the sofa at a distance, watching Harold work wood on the balcony with the hungry look of a child staring at his father, listening to Margaret tell Jade stories about the past in a voice thick with longing. And every time he heard her mention the son she'd lost, Xavier's heart flinched like a blade sliding in. Night after night, he stood outside their door once he was sure they'd gone to sleep, his back against the cold wall, listening to their prayers before bed. Margaret's voice trembled as she read from the Bible. "Lord, I beg you to forgive us for the greatest sin of our lives. We gave up our first child, an innocent baby who did nothing wrong. Please protect him wherever he is, and if he's still alive, let me see him one more time before we die." And Harold whispered, "Amen. That sin will follow us until we close our eyes." Xavier stood there with his fists clenched so hard his nails cut into his palms, no tears falling because he'd learned not to cry at 8 years old. But his heart hurt so much he thought it might break. It hurt because they had never forgotten him. It hurt because he understood they'd lived in guilt and regret for 38 years. It hurt because he realized they loved him, even without knowing who he was. And it hurt because he was terrified that when they learned the truth, they wouldn't be able to accept a son who was a cold-blooded killer. 2 weeks after Xavier received the DNA results, while he was slowly accepting the truth that he had found his biological parents and trying to decide what to do next, fate delivered another upheaval he hadn't anticipated. Because Harold and Margaret's 5 ungrateful children, after selling the home from their parents' childhood for $3 million and splitting the money to spend, suddenly began to feel a flicker of curiosity, mixed with guilt about what had happened to their elderly parents. And Brandon, the oldest, a successful lawyer with an office on Park Avenue, decided to hire a private investigator to find out where the old couple had ended up. The investigator didn't take long to discover that Harold and Margaret Brennan were living in the 45th floor penthouse of Knight Tower, one of the most expensive buildings in Manhattan, under the protection of Xavier Sterling Knight. When Brandon shared that information with his 4 siblings, all of them were shocked and confused, unable to understand why their poor parents had any connection to a notorious mafia boss. On a Friday afternoon, near the end of February, when the snow had melted and Manhattan was starting to prepare for an early spring, all 5 children showed up in the lobby of Knight Tower. Brandon in a gray Armani suit, Tyler still wearing a doctor's white coat with his hospital badge, Chelsea in an expensive Chanel dress, Amber carrying a Hermes handbag, and Travis, the only one who looked uncomfortable, his face pale and his eyes full of fear. They marched straight to the reception desk. Brandon spoke with authority. "We need to see Mr. Harold Brennan and Mrs. Margaret Brennan immediately. They're our parents." But 2 massive security guards with earpieces and handguns hidden beneath their jackets stepped out to block them. One of them spoke coldly. "The 45th floor penthouse is a private area. No one goes up without Mr. Knight's permission." Brandon's anger flared and his voice rose. "I'm a lawyer. I can sue you and this building for unlawful detention." Jax, standing in a corner of the lobby watching the security cameras, immediately called Xavier, who was in his office on the 42nd floor. "Boss, there are 5 people claiming to be the Brennans' children causing trouble in the lobby." Xavier's voice came back like ice. "Keep them there. I'm coming down." 3 minutes later, the private elevator doors opened, and Xavier stepped out in a flawless black Tom Ford suit, his dark hair slicked neatly back, his cold blue eyes sweeping over the 5 people clustered in the lobby as if they were insects beneath his shoe. The air around him seemed to turn colder, and everyone in the lobby fell silent. Brandon, with the manufactured confidence of a lawyer used to twisting words, stepped forward. "I'm Brandon Brennan, attorney at Morrison & Associates. My parents, Harold James Brennan and Margaret Rose Brennan, are being kidnapped and unlawfully held by you in this building. I demand you release them immediately or I'll contact the police and the FBI." He tried to sound commanding, but his voice trembled slightly when he met Xavier's eyes. Xavier smiled, a cold smile with no humor, and moved close enough that Brandon had to back up several steps. Kidnapped, unlawfully held. Interesting words coming from people who threw their elderly parents onto the street like trash, sold their house to split the money, and left them to die under the Queensboro Bridge on a cold, rainy night in November. Xavier's voice stayed even, but every word landed like a knife in the conscience of all 5. Chelsea stepped up, her carefully done makeup twisting with anger. That's our family business. You have no right to interfere." Xavier turned his gaze on her with pure contempt. "Family business. From the day you forced them out, from the day you chose money over love, they stopped being your family. They're mine now." Tyler, a surgeon with a Columbia degree, tried to stay calm. "You don't have the right to decide that. Legally, we're their biological children." But Xavier took a single step forward, and Tyler swallowed hard and backed away. Xavier's voice dropped into something dangerous, like the growl of an animal. "I'm Xavier Sterling Knight. I control half the east coast of this city. I can wipe out your whole family in one night, and no one will dare ask questions. I can make you disappear like you never existed. So I suggest you leave right now, before I change my mind, and decide the world would be better without 5 shameless people like you." The 5 children stood frozen, faces drained of color. Amber whispered, shaking, "We should go." Brandon tried to hold on to his pride. "I'll sue you," but his feet were already turning toward the door. Chelsea sobbed as she hurried after him. Tyler couldn't bring himself to look back, and the 4 of them rushed out of the building as if a demon were chasing them. Only Travis remained, the youngest, 30 years old, hollow-faced from gambling addiction and crushing debt. He stayed rooted in place, legs shaking, tears running down his cheeks, then dropped to his knees in the middle of the luxurious lobby while strangers stared. "Mr. Knight, I know my siblings and I are disgusting. I know we don't deserve forgiveness. But please, please let me see my parents just once. Let me apologize before it's too late. I'll do anything you want." His voice broke so badly he could barely get the words out. Xavier looked down at the man kneeling in front of him, a brother he hadn't even known existed until a few weeks earlier. And one part of him wanted to forgive, wanted to say yes. But the larger part, the part that had lived in darkness for 38 years, the part that had heard his parents cry every night for the sin they carried, couldn't accept an apology that came this easily. His voice stayed cold. "It's not enough. The pain you caused them can't be erased by cheap tears. Go home and live with what you've done. If one day you truly regret it, and you prove it, maybe then I'll consider it." While Travis was still on his knees in the lobby of Knight Tower with tears of regret, and Xavier walked away, leaving him alone with a guilt that couldn't be washed clean, somewhere else in Manhattan. In the 20th floor, presidential suite of the Plaza Hotel, with a view over Central Park, Anatoly Petrov sat in an expensive leather chair with a glass of pure Russian vodka in his hand, his cold blue eyes fixed on a spread of surveillance photos scattered across the wooden table in front of him. Anatoly, 55, with silver hair slicked neatly back and the angular Slavic face of a man built for cruelty, was the new generation Russian Mafia boss who rose after Dmitry Volkov's death 5 years ago. And for the last 5 years, he had quietly rebuilt Dmitry's empire with one single objective: revenge against Xavier Sterling Knight, the man who had killed his mentor and closest friend during the bloody purge in Brooklyn. Over the last 3 months, Anatoly had assigned men to track Xavier's every move, and what he discovered pulled a vicious smile across his mouth. Because Xavier Sterling Knight, a man known to have no weaknesses, no family, no loved ones, had suddenly begun spending far more time at his penthouse, and inside that penthouse were 3 people he seemed to care about in a way that was unmistakably abnormal: 2 elderly people around 70, and a thin young woman with long brown hair. Anatoly lifted one photo, a candid shot of Harold carving wood on the balcony. Another showed Margaret cooking in the kitchen. The third showed Jade buying vegetables at a nearby farmer's market, 2 of Xavier's security men following close behind. In Anatoly's mind, the pieces began to slide together into a perfect picture of Xavier Knight's fatal weakness. He picked up his phone, hit speed dial, and his low voice, heavy with a Russian accent, filled the room. "Yuri, get up here now." 5 minutes later, Yuri Volkov, Dmitry's cousin and Anatoly's most trusted right hand, walked into the suite with a hard face and a long scar running from his forehead down to his left cheek, a souvenir from a knife fight last year. Anatoly pointed at the photos. "Look at this. I've found the way to bring down that dog Xavier Knight. These 3 are clearly family or people he cares about. If we take them, he'll have to choose between his empire and their lives." Yuri frowned. "You're sure this is his weakness?" "Xavier Knight never has family." Anatoly shook his head. "That's exactly why it's suspicious. Why would a man who never lets anyone near him suddenly allow 3 strangers to live in the most private penthouse he has? Why does he send 2 guards to follow that woman every time she goes outside? No, this is his secret family, and we're going to use them to destroy him. Anatoly stood and walked to the window, looking out over Central Park fading into sunset, his voice cold. Prepare 12 of our best armed men, the ones who aren't afraid to die. AK-47s and Glock pistols. I want all 3 taken alive. Don't hurt them unless you have to. We need them breathing as bait. He turned back to Yuri. Night tower security is too tight. We can't enter through the front doors or the elevators. But I bought a building maintenance engineer. He says the ventilation system from the 44th floor can lead up to the 45th. We'll go in that way at 2 in the morning, when security is at its lowest. Yuri nodded, his eyes bright with the excitement of a man about to do what he did best. And after we take them, boss. Anatoly smiled without warmth. Then Xavier Knight will choose. Either he hands over all of Brooklyn territory he stole from Dmitri 5 years ago, plus the port zone at Red Hook, and control of the drug shipping line from Mexico, or these 3 will die in the most painful way possible. And it won't stop there. I'll humiliate him in front of the entire New York underworld so everyone sees Xavier Sterling Knight isn't unbeatable. He's just a weak man the moment someone he loves is threatened. Anatoly's voice was thick with hatred and the hunger to avenge his dead friend. And in that Manhattan night, while Harold and Margaret sat watching TV in the penthouse they believed was safe, while Jade read before sleep, and while Xavier worked in his office unaware that danger was closing in, Anatoly Petrov finished his final plan to strike 3 days later. A plan that would change all of their lives in a way that couldn't be reversed. 2 nights after Anatoly finalized his attack plan without anyone in the penthouse knowing, while Manhattan sank into the deep sleep of March and cold winds slid through the seams of high-rise buildings, Jade lay on her bed in her small room and still couldn't fall asleep even though her body was exhausted. Because tonight was like every other night for the last 2 years. The nightmare of Lily came crashing back. The image of her tiny girl with the same green eyes as her mother lying in a hospital tangled in tubes and wires, the heart monitor beeping and beeping until it turned into one long, flat sound, and Jade jolted awake with her heart racing and her pillow soaked with tears. She sat up, checked the clock, and saw it was 3 in the morning, and she knew sleep wasn't coming back tonight. She pulled on a thin sweater and stepped into the living room, meaning to make tea, but her feet carried her to the large balcony instead, where the sliding glass door had been left cracked open. When she pushed it wider, the 3-degree wind hit her hard, and she shivered. But what made her freeze wasn't the cold. It was the man standing there. Xavier leaned back against the glass railing, a tumbler of amber whiskey in his hand, ice catching city light in small flashes. He wore a black suit, but had taken off his vest, leaving only a white dress shirt with the top 2 buttons undone, his throat and part of his chest exposed. Sleeves rolled to his elbows, revealing strong forearms. In the dark, his face looked more tired than Jade had ever seen, the lines around his eyes deeper, his jaw clenched as if he were enduring some invisible pain. He turned when he heard her footsteps, cold blue eyes meeting her wet green ones, and for a long stretch of silence neither of them spoke, until Jade asked softly, "You're not sleeping?" Xavier took a sip of whiskey before he answered. "Men in my line of work don't get to sleep deeply. 1 second of carelessness can be the last second of your life." Jade moved a little closer, stopping a few steps away, arms wrapped around herself for warmth, staring out over Manhattan glittering to the horizon. "Are you lonely?" The question surprised even her. Xavier looked at her with something unfamiliar in his gaze. Not cold, but more like recognition. "You're lonely too," he said, not as a question, but as a fact that couldn't be denied. Jade nodded slowly, her voice shaking, not only from the cold. "It's been 5 years. Since Dmitri died and my daughter left, I've lived alone. No one. Nowhere I belong. Just working and surviving day by day, and maybe because the night was too late, because the air was too quiet, because they were both lonely people who'd found each other in the dark." Xavier asked something he had never asked anyone. "Tell me about your daughter." His voice sounded strangely gentle. Jade swallowed and tears started sliding down her cheeks again. Unstoppable. Her name was Lily. She had green eyes like mine, soft brown hair, and she loved red roses. Every time we walked past a flower shop, she'd point and laugh, her voice like a bell. Her throat tightened. She died when she was only 3, a congenital heart condition. The doctors said she needed surgery immediately, but it cost $200,000. I didn't have it. I tried to borrow everywhere, but who lends money to the widow of a mafia boss? And all I could do was watch my baby get weaker day by day until her heart stopped in my arms at a Brooklyn charity hospital. Jade broke into sobs. I'm the worst mother in the world. I couldn't save her. I let her die because I was poor. What happened next shocked both of them. Xavier set his whiskey down on the railing, stepped close, and for the first time in 38 years, he touched someone with gentleness. His thumb brushed a tear from Jade's cheek, and his voice dropped low. You did everything you could. You loved your daughter with everything you had. That's the only thing a child truly needs. Not money or expensive hospitals, but a mother's love. And Lily had that until her last second. Jade looked into Xavier's eyes and saw a pain like her own hidden behind the ice, and she whispered, like Harold and Margaret inside. They did everything they could for 5 children, sacrificed their whole lives, and they were still betrayed in the cruelest way. Sometimes, no matter how hard we try, life still isn't fair to the best people. Xavier stayed silent for a long time, his hand still resting lightly on Jade's face. And in that moment, the 2 loneliest people in this building understood each other without needing words. They were both people who had lost too much, who had watched fate's injustice up close, who had lived in darkness so long that light felt foreign. And in the freezing air of the Manhattan night, with the city asleep below and the stars hidden behind clouds, Jade and Xavier stood closer than they ever had, not in body, but in soul. And for the first time in 5 years, Jade felt she wasn't completely alone anymore, while Xavier, who had built walls around his heart since he was 8, felt a small crack open in that wall. The next morning, after the night on the balcony had created a fragile thread between 2 lonely souls, Jade woke with something unfamiliar in her chest. She didn't feel completely hollow the way she used to, and she walked into the dining area to prepare breakfast for Harold and Margaret when she noticed Xavier's black iPhone sitting on the glass table. He must have forgotten it when he rushed out to work early. Jade picked it up, intending to place it safely in his room, but the screen lit from her touch, and what appeared in front of her made her heart stop. A PDF file was open, its title bold across the top. Dimitri Volko, Yada Emilia Winter's widow. Confidential investigation report. Her hands began to shake. Logic told her not to look, that this was a violation of privacy. But curiosity and fear pushed her thumb to scroll, and what she read made the world tilt. A detailed file on her from the date of her birth, March 28, 1999. Photos from her high school years. A wedding picture with Dimitri when she was 20, her terror hidden behind a forced smile. Hospital records documenting 3 broken ribs, 1 fractured wrist, countless bruises. Police reports from neighbors, calling about screaming that never led to arrests because Dimitri had money and power. Jade kept scrolling as tears blurred her vision. There was a detailed report about the night Dimitri was killed 5 years ago, including a diagram of the house, the basement location where she'd been locked, the exact timeline of the gunfight from 11:45 at night to 12:15 in the morning. And at the end of the file, a handwritten line in black ink in Xavier's sharp, angular script. I don't regret killing him. He deserved worse. Beneath it was another line. Find her. Make sure she's safe. Jade's heart slammed in her chest, heat rushing to her face. And suddenly everything from the last 3 months carried a different meaning. Xavier hadn't saved them by chance. He'd known who she was from the beginning. He'd been watching her, and that truth made her furious and dizzy with confusion all at once. Without thinking, Jade clutched the phone and hurried down the long hallway, and for the first time, she violated Rule 3 that had been set on day 1. She threw open the door to the private office in the north wing. Xavier was sitting behind his desk with a laptop and a stack of files, and he looked up in surprise when he saw her. But before he could speak, Jade slammed the phone onto the mahogany desk with a sharp thud, her voice shaking with anger. You knew who I was from the beginning, didn't you? The air in the room thickened. Xavier looked at the phone, saw the open file, then looked back at Jade with a face that held no emotion. His voice was cold, as it always was. Yes, a single word with no apology, no explanation. And that blunt answer made Jade angrier. Why didn't you tell me? Why pretend you didn't know? Why follow me like I'm a criminal? Her voice kept rising. Xavier stood, came around the desk, braced his hands on the edge, his voice still flat. It wasn't necessary. Who you are doesn't change the fact you and the Brennans needed somewhere to live. Jade let out a bitter laugh, tears streaming down her cheeks. Not necessary. You investigated every detail of my life. You know every injury I've ever had, every night I got beaten, And you're telling me it wasn't necessary? She stepped closer, her voice trembling. I'm Dmitry Volkov's wife, the man you killed 5 years ago. You killed my husband. You made my daughter lose her father. And now what are you doing? Paying for your sins. Pitying me. Xavier straightened and stepped close enough that she could smell his expensive cologne, his blue eyes boring into hers with terrifying intensity. He deserved to die, and you know that better than anyone. Jade didn't back away. But you still killed my husband. My daughter lost her father because of you. She shouted it, and this time Xavier truly snapped, his voice dropping into something dangerous. He wasn't a father. He was a monster who abused you, beat you when you were 7 months pregnant, shattered your ribs 3 times in 4 years, locked you in a dark basement without food or water, treated you like an animal, and you dare call him a father to that baby. Jade stumbled back a step, shocked, not by the words, but by how much Xavier knew, details only she had ever carried. You know everything. Her voice shrank. Xavier nodded, his voice still cold, but there was something else behind it now. I know everything. I know he broke your ribs 3 times and the doctors told you not to go to the police. I know he made you stand outside in the snow for 2 hours when you were 5 months pregnant because you dared to argue with him. I know you tried to kill yourself twice with sleeping pills and it didn't work because you were afraid for the baby inside you. Jade collapsed into a nearby chair, her face in her hands, sobbing as the memories came back like a tidal wave. Her voice broke. Then why did you help me? Because you pitied me. Because you felt responsible. Xavier went quiet for a long moment, then stepped closer, dropped to one knee in front of her so he could meet her eyes at the same level, and gripped her shoulders with a touch that was both strong and careful. No. Because I owe you. His voice trembled for the first time. Jade stared at him through tears. Owe me what? I don't understand. Xavier drew a deep breath, as if he was forcing himself to say something he had never admitted out loud. That night, when I went to Dmitry's house to kill him over territory, I knew you were in the basement. I heard you crying through surveillance footage my men hacked, but I still chose to kill Dmitry first. I chose to finish the job first. And when I went down to the basement to find you, you were unconscious, going into premature labor from the stress and terror. His voice caught. If I'd come 10 minutes earlier, if I'd saved you before I killed him, your daughter might have. He couldn't finish. But Jade understood, and that truth hurt worse than anything she'd ever known. That Lily might not have been born early, might not have had a heart condition so severe, might still be alive if Xavier had chosen differently. They sat there in a dense silence. Jade cried without stopping. Xavier stayed kneeling in front of her with his head bowed. 2 lonely people carrying pain and guilt over the death of an innocent child. And in that moment, through anger, grief, and understanding, an invisible cord tied them tighter than ever. Not through love or forgiveness, but through a shared wound that only the 2 of them could truly understand. The heavy silence between Xavier and Jade after that painful confession about Lily's death shattered with violence when the office door flew open without a knock. Jax burst in, face drained of color, a Glock already drawn from its holster, shouting, "Boss, they're in." 12 armed men came through the ventilation system from the 44th floor. Cameras show they've got AK-47s. Xavier didn't need a second to think. Survival instinct and 30 years of underworld training ignited in him. He sprang up, yanked open the desk drawer, grabbed his loaded Glock 17, then turned and shoved Jade toward the door. Down to 40 through the stairwell in the side corridor. Take Harold and Margaret. Don't come back. His voice was steel, but Jade heard the worry buried underneath it. Jade ran out with her heart slamming so hard it felt like it might crack. Legs shaking but still pushing her down the long hallway toward the living room. But the moment she turned the corner, what she saw froze her in place. 3 large men in black masks and body armor were restraining Harold and Margaret. One held Harold in a choke from behind, another pressed a gun to Margaret's temple, and the third swept the apartment with an AK-47. Margaret saw Jade and screamed, voice shaking, "Jade, run, sweetheart, run." But nothing inside Jade could run. All she saw were 2 old people who had become her family in danger, and without thinking, she lunged forward, shouting, "Let them go. I'll do anything you want." From the stairwell on the other side of the penthouse, 9 more armed men surged up, and in the middle of them stood Yuri Volkov with his hard face and the long scar down his cheek. He looked Jade over with a cold, measuring stare. "Who are you to Xavier Knight? His lover, his wife, Or just his pet dog? His voice dripped with mockery. Jade clenched her teeth. I'm nobody. Just the help. Let the old couple go. They're innocent. Yuri gave a thin laugh and stepped closer, drawing a Glock 19 from his waistband and aiming it at Jade's forehead. Then it's not necessary. His finger started tightening on the trigger. Time seemed to stop. Jade saw the barrel, saw the flare of intent in Yuri's eyes, and in that split second she thought of Lily. Thought that maybe she'd finally get to see her little girl again. But death didn't come. Something cut through the air like lightning. A combat knife with an 8-inch blade drove straight through Yuri's right wrist with horrifying precision. Bone crushed. The gun clattered onto the marble floor with a sharp metallic ring, and before Yuri could even scream, Xavier appeared from the hallway like a ghost. No gun in his hands, only 2 fists and a body built to kill. 10 seconds. Only 10 seconds. Xavier twisted away from the nearest gunfire, seized the first man by the neck, and snapped it with a sickening crack. Used the collapsing body as a shield against bullets from the second, then drove a brutal kick into the third man's knee, dropped him, and ended him with one hard punch to the temple. 3 men dead or unconscious in 10 seconds left Jade and the others staring in shock. But the remaining 8 weren't amateurs. They recovered fast, drew pistols, and closed in around Xavier, while 4 others moved like machines to restrain Harold and Margaret, and yank Jade back, binding all 3 with metal wire. And no matter how badly Xavier wanted to keep fighting, he couldn't risk it with guns pressed to the heads of the 3 people he cared about. Yuri, his right arm still bleeding with the knife still pinned through it, used his left hand to hold up a tablet and start a video call. Anatoly Petrov's face appeared on the screen, smiling with vicious satisfaction. Xavier Knight, I finally found your weakness. Who would have thought a cold, heartless bastard like you would care about 3 nobodies like this? Xavier stood still, eyes locked on the camera with a stare sharp enough to kill. Anatoly, if you touch one hair on their heads, I swear I'll slaughter your entire bloodline. From your mother in St. Petersburg to your 3-year-old niece in Moscow. No one survives. His voice was so cold it felt inhuman. Anatoly only laughed. Cute threat, but you're not in a position to threaten anyone anymore. Here are my terms. You have 24 hours to hand over all of Brooklyn, including 3 ports, 12 warehouses, and every shipping route you control. If you don't, these 3 die in the most painful way imaginable, and I'll film it and send it to the entire New York underworld so they can watch Xavier Knight kneel. Harold and Margaret clung to each other, shaking. Jade looked at Xavier with fear, but also something else, maybe faith that he would save them. And Xavier, who had never felt fear in 38 years, felt it for the first time. Real fear, not for himself, but for the people who were becoming his family. His voice ground out through his teeth. If your men hurt them, I'll make you wish you were never born. I'll peel your skin off millimeter by millimeter. I'll make you beg to die and I won't let you. Anatoly kept smiling. I'll be waiting for your call in 24 hours, Knight. Don't disappoint me. Then, the screen went dark. The 8 armed men moved fast, dragging Harold, Margaret, and Jade toward the service elevator in the back. Xavier tried to lunge forward, but 3 guns lifted to his head forced him to stop. And in the last second before the elevator doors closed, Jade's eyes met Xavier's. No words, but both of them understood. This might be the last time they ever saw each other. When the doors slid shut, Xavier stood in the wrecked penthouse with 3 bodies on the floor, fists clenched until his nails cut into his palms and blood welled, and he let out a long, raw scream of rage and pain that echoed through the building. The drive from Manhattan to Brooklyn in a black windowless van lasted 30 minutes. 3 people bound tight with metal wire that bit into skin until it bled, blindfolded with black cloth, and thrown onto the floor like cargo. Harold coughed again and again because the air inside the van was suffocating. Margaret trembled and whispered prayers under her breath. Jade forced herself to stay calm, even though her heart hammered like a drum in her ribcage, trying to memorize every turn and shift in the road so she'd know where they were if a chance to escape ever came. When the van stopped and the back doors flew open, the March wind slammed into them, carrying the salty bite of seawater and the stink of diesel from a nearby port. The 3 of them were yanked out roughly, dragged across uneven ground, and when the blindfolds were ripped away, they found themselves inside an old warehouse stretching hundreds of feet, cracked brick walls, a high ceiling punched with holes that let the wind pour through, a concrete floor so cold it felt wet, nothing but a few rotting wooden crates, and the thick stink of mold. Yuri, his arm wrapped in a sloppy bandage and his face pinched with pain, pointed to the farthest corner. "Sit there. Don't talk loud. Don't try to run. 2 men are on the door. If you do anything suspicious, I'll shoot all 3 of you without asking Anatoly." Then he and the other 10 men left, leaving only 2 armed guards with AKs posted by the large steel door 20 meters away. The 3 of them sank onto the freezing concrete, hands still bound behind their backs until shoulders and arms went numb. Harold and Margaret pressed close to share warmth. Jade sat between them, trying to use her smaller body as a shield, blocking the wind that knifed through the holes in the wall toward the 2 old people. Outside, it was 2 degrees, but in this warehouse it felt below 0 because the wind never stopped. Time crawled in silence, maybe an hour, maybe 2, no one could tell, until Margaret whispered, voice shaking from cold and fear, "Sweetheart, we can't let Xavier give up his whole empire for 3 useless old people like us. We have to find a way to tell them we're willing to die so he doesn't have to choose." Jade shook her head hard, her voice fierce even though her lips had turned blue. "You don't understand. Xavier isn't that kind of man. He won't abandon the people he cares about. He'll come for us even if it costs him everything." Harold spoke then, weak and hoarse. "But honey, we're strangers he happened to save. We aren't worth him losing everything for." Jade turned to them with reddened eyes, her voice breaking. "You aren't strangers. You're his family. Even if he hasn't said it, I've seen the way he looks at you, the way he pays attention to every meal you eat and every hour you sleep. That's not how a man treats strangers. That's how a son treats his parents." Margaret looked at Jade with understanding, and a small smile touched her mouth even in this nightmare. "You love him, don't you?" The simple question stabbed straight through Jade's chest. She stayed silent for a long time, tears sliding down her cold face. Then she gave the smallest nod, her voice trembling. "I don't know when it started. Maybe the night I bandaged his wound. Maybe the night we talked on the balcony about pain nobody understands. Or maybe the moment he admitted he might have saved Lily sooner if he'd chosen differently. I saw the real person inside him, not a cold Mafia boss, but a lonely man carrying too much damage." Jade broke into sobs. "But someone like me doesn't deserve him. I'm the widow of the enemy he killed. I'm the mother who let her child die. I have nothing to offer him except a dark past and a future that isn't even sure." Margaret, even with her hands bound, shifted as much as she could and pulled Jade into her with her shoulder, holding her like a daughter, whispering with fierce tenderness, "Don't ever say that again, sweetheart. You deserve every good thing in this world. You've endured too much, lost too much, sacrificed too much for other people. Now it's your turn to be happy. And if Xavier is the man who makes you happy, then that's the most beautiful thing of all. There's no such thing as deserving or not deserving in love. There's only whether 2 people want to be together or not." The 3 of them held each other in the darkness of the warehouse. Harold leaned his head against his wife and against Jade, forming a small circle of warmth in the biting cold. And in that moment, even with fate uncertain, even with death hovering close, they found comfort in each other. They found family in the worst place. And all 3 of them prayed in silence that Xavier would come in time, not because they were afraid to die, but because they wanted more time together, wanted to say what hadn't been said, wanted to live long enough to see love between Xavier and Jade get the chance to bloom. While Harold, Margaret, and Jade were trembling in the darkness of a Brooklyn warehouse, waiting for fate to decide what would be left of them, 3 levels beneath Night Tower, behind a meter of concrete and absolute soundproofing, Xavier stood in front of 50 of his most elite men, the ones who had followed him through countless wars and would die for him without hesitation. All of them watched their boss in a silence so hard it felt like stone, because something in his face tonight wasn't the usual cold command. It was something they had rarely, if ever, seen. Jack stood beside him with a map of Red Hook spread across a large metal table, red dots marking possible warehouse locations his people had identified after tailing Anatoly's van. His voice carried worry he didn't bother to hide. "Boss, if we breach, they'll execute the hostages immediately. Anatoly isn't a man with a conscience. He won't hesitate to put a bullet in their heads, just to punish you." Xavier wore black Kevlar under his shirt, checking the magazine of his Glock 17, voice like ice but threaded with something else, maybe fear. "I know. That's why we run 2 plans. Plan A, I go in alone and negotiate, unarmed, so Anatoly thinks he's winning. Plan B, if a single drop of their blood spills, You wipe out everything inside that warehouse. No survivors. Dr. Freya stood in the corner with a large medical kit, her voice shaking slightly. And if both plans fail, Xavier, if Anatoly refuses to negotiate and kills them before we can move, the question crushed the bunker into an airless quiet. 50 pairs of eyes locked on Xavier, waiting for an answer. Xavier lifted his head, and for the first time in 38 years, the men who followed him saw a different Xavier. Not the emotionless killer, but a man terrified of losing the only things that mattered. Then I trade my life. I offer Anatoly me instead of them. I'll go to my knees and beg if I have to, because they're my family. They're the only people in my life who ever made me feel like I wasn't completely alone. I can lose my empire. I can lose money and power, but I can't lose them. Jack swallowed hard. Boss. Xavier shook his head. Don't. You already know what to do. 20 of our snipers are in position around the warehouse from the buildings nearby. 30 of you will breach from the back and side doors. You move only on my signal. I go through the front alone to draw Anatoly's eyes. At 11 at night, the black Rolls-Royce Phantom slid through the dark streets of Red Hook. Xavier behind the wheel himself. No driver, no escort. Alone in a black suit, with no visible weapon. When the car stopped in front of the decaying warehouse with dim light leaking through its seams, he drew in one deep breath and stepped out into the wind that cut like a blade. 2 guards at the door jerked at the sight of him. One raised his radio, reporting, "Boss is here. Alone. No weapons." 30 seconds later, the large steel door groaned open. Inside, Anatoly Petrov sat on a battered wooden chair like a king on a counterfeit throne, surrounded by 12 armed men with guns trained on Xavier. And in the far corner, Harold, Margaret, and Jade were bound tight, 2 pistols pressed to their heads. Anatoly threw his head back and laughed, clapping with mocking applause. Xavier Sterling Knight, the man the entire East Coast underworld fears. And now you've come to kneel before me. It's a beautiful feeling. His voice dripped with ridicule, but Xavier didn't look at him. His eyes went straight to the 3 people in the corner, Jade shaking, Harold coughing, Margaret silently crying, and his heart felt like it was being crushed in a vice. Xavier finally turned to Anatoly, voice cold but missing the murderous edge it usually carried. Release them. I'll give you all of Brooklyn, 4 ports, 20 warehouses, and 3 major shipping lanes. Anatoly shook his head, smiling like a man savoring blood. Not enough, Xavier. I want all of Manhattan. Every territory you control, from Harlem to the Lower East Side, from Chelsea to Tribeca, all of it. And you leave New York forever. Xavier's jaw clenched. You're insane. Manhattan is half my empire. You're asking too much. Anatoly stood and strolled closer, that vicious smile never leaving his face. No, I'm just watching you choose. Empire or these 3 nobodies. Power or feeling. Choose, Xavier Knight. And let the whole underworld see you're just a weak human like everyone else. The warehouse went so quiet it felt like suffocation. Every gaze pinned Xavier. Jade shook her head in a small, desperate plea for him not to choose them. Harold and Margaret shook their heads too, refusing to let him destroy himself for them. But Xavier looked into their eyes and saw everything he needed to know. They were the reason he still wanted to live. They were light in the darkness of 38 years. His voice came out steady. I choose them. I give up Manhattan. I give up everything. But you release them now. Anatoly's expression flickered with real surprise. You mean it? You're ready to lose everything for 3 people like this? Xavier nodded once. Yes, but you won't live long enough to enjoy it. Then he snapped his fingers, sharp and loud in the hollow air. 1 second later, 20 sniper shots cracked at once. Bullets punched through the high windows. Glass exploded in a rain of shards. Light from outside blasted in like a spotlight, turning the room into a stage. 50 of Xavier's men stormed from 3 directions, gunfire erupting, smoke and muzzle flash turning the warehouse into chaos. Anatoly's men fired back, a brutal firefight shaking the walls. Xavier didn't hesitate. He launched toward Jade, Harold, and Margaret like an arrow. But Anatoly was faster. He grabbed Jade by the hair and yanked her upright, slammed a Glock against her temple, and screamed, "Stop, or she dies." In the middle of muzzle flash and smoke, in the screaming chaos of dying men and men still fighting, Anatoly Petrov stood with a Glock pressed to Jade's temple, his other hand twisted in her hair so hard it forced her head back. Xavier was 3 meters away with his Glock 17 raised, but he couldn't squeeze the trigger because one stray shot could split Jade's skull. Jade looked into Xavier's eyes, tears sliding down a face smeared with dust and blood, her voice shaking. "Don't do this for me. Just shoot. Don't let him win." Xavier shook his head, his voice rough with iron and something deeper. "I told you I owed you a life from 5 years ago. Let me pay it now. I won't let anyone hurt you again." Anatoly sneered and shoved the barrel harder into Jade's head until she made a small sound of pain. How touching. Romeo and Juliet of the Mafia world. "Now drop the gun, Xavier, or this girl's brains are going on the floor." But before Xavier could react, a shout erupted from the back entrance of the warehouse, sharp enough to snap heads around. Unbeknownst to Xavier, the 5 siblings had refused to stay away. Driven by a sudden, gut-wrenching guilt, they had reached out to Regina Hawthorne, following her lead as she tracked Xavier's signal to the Brooklyn docks. 5 people appeared at the rear door, 2 of Xavier's guards trying to stop them, Brandon in a wrinkled suit, Tyler with a torn doctor's coat, Chelsea sobbing, Amber shaking, and Travis with a face set in desperate determination. All of them were yelling, "Let them go! Let our parents go!" Anatoly frowned, thrown off. "Who the hell are you? Why are you here?" Travis stepped forward, voice trembling but steady. "They're my parents. Those 2 old people are Harold and Margaret Brennan, our parents. Please don't kill them. Kill me instead." Anatoly threw his head back and laughed, a wild sound echoing off the cracked brick. "Beautiful. Xavier Knight has 2 hostage families now. Or is this some kind of joke?" Nobody understood what was happening until a woman burst through the front entrance, hair dark and slick with sweat, clutching a thick file of papers. Regina Hawthorne, the private investigator. She screamed, voice hoarse and urgent. "Xavier, I have to tell you. They're your biological parents. The DNA is 99.7%. Harold and Margaret Brennan are your parents." Time stopped. The warehouse fell into a terrifying hush, even with sporadic gunfire still popping outside. Every eye locked on Xavier, on Harold and Margaret, on the 5 children standing frozen with mouths open, on Jax and Xavier's men staring at their boss in shock, and even Anatoly stiffened like he hadn't heard right. Harold and Margaret, still bound, still hurting, stared at Xavier as realization widened their eyes. Margaret whispered, shaking, my son, dear God, he's—" She couldn't finish. Harold's voice came out raw. "I abandoned you. I abandoned you 38 years ago, and now you're the one saving us." Anatoly's single moment of distraction, as he tried to process the impossible, was the only opening there would be. Xavier didn't hesitate. He lifted the Glock 17 and fired one precise shot into Anatoly's right wrist. The bullet shattered bone. The Glock clanged onto the concrete. Jade ripped free in that instant, dropped and rolled away, and Jack surged in with 10 men, taking Anatoly down in 8 seconds with professional efficiency, forcing him face first to the floor, wrenching his arms behind his back, slapping cuffs on him. The rescue ended with Anatoly Petrov captured alive. Jade staggered to her feet, trembling, taking in the sudden shift as Anatoly's men either lay dead or surrendered. Then she ran with everything left in her exhausted body straight to Xavier, threw herself into him, holding on so tight it hurt. Xavier let the gun drop, wrapped both arms around her, buried his face in her hair, and his voice shook as he whispered, "You're safe. I'm here. I'm sorry I was late." But it wasn't time for only the 2 of them. Not with Harold and Margaret standing there, wire still biting into their wrists, staring at Xavier with tear-filled eyes as the truth landed in full. Jax cut their bindings quickly, and the moment they were free, Margaret stepped toward Xavier on unsteady legs, her voice breaking. Are you the baby I left at the church 38 years ago?" Xavier slowly released Jade and faced the woman who had given birth to him. For the first time since childhood, his blue eyes went red and wet, and he nodded, unable to form words. Harold dropped to his knees on the cold concrete, his legs no longer able to carry the weight of 38 years of guilt, sobbing, "The son we abandoned, the son we thought we lost forever. And now he's the one saving our lives. Dear God, how can our sin be this big?" Xavier sank down in front of his father, placed both hands on Harold's shoulders, and for the first time his true emotion broke through his voice. "Dad, Mom," 2 simple words, holding 38 years of longing, loneliness, and searching. Margaret didn't hesitate. She dropped to her knees and pulled Xavier's head into her chest like he was still a child, crying hard. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't want to leave you. I was too poor. I didn't have any other way. I thought you'd have a better life with someone else. I didn't know what you'd have to endure." Xavier held Harold shaking beside them, and for the first time in 38 years, tears streamed down the face of the coldest man on the East Coast. He cried like a boy who had finally found his parents again, his voice breaking. "I'm not angry. I never was. I just wanted to find you. I just wanted to know you were still alive. I searched for 38 years, and now I've found you. That's all I ever needed." The three of them clung to each other on the frozen warehouse floor, blood and tears mixing. Nearby, Jade stood crying. Jax wiped his eyes. 50 of Xavier's men turned their faces away so no one would see their own tears. And the 5 children, Brandon, Tyler, Chelsea, Amber, and Travis, stood at a distance with pale faces, hit by the horrifying truth. The terrifying, powerful man they'd come to fear, Xavier Sterling Knight, was their older brother, the first child their parents had lost, the one who came back to save Harold and Margaret from ruin when the 5 children raised on all that love had betrayed and discarded them in the cruelest way possible. A week after the tear-soaked reunion in that Brooklyn warehouse, after Dr. Freya had examined Harold and Margaret thoroughly and confirmed they'd suffered only minor injuries and shock, after the raw marks on their wrists from the wire had been cleaned and bandaged, after they'd finally slept their first peaceful night since the nightmare, Saturday afternoon settled over the penthouse in a rare kind of warmth. Winter sunlight poured through the tall glass windows and laid soft golden streaks across the white marble floor. Then the doorbell rang. Jax opened the door and found 5 people standing there, hollow-eyed and worn down by a week without sleep. A week of guilt that hadn't loosened its grip for a single second. Brandon, Tyler, Chelsea, Amber, and Travis stood trembling in the doorway, dressed neatly but looking older than they had any right to look. Brandon's voice came out hoarse. "We need to see our parents. Please, give us one chance." Jax held their gaze, saw something real in it, not performance but regret that had chewed through pride, and he turned his head toward the living room where Xavier sat on the sofa with a newspaper in his hands. "Boss, they're here." Xavier lowered his eyes from the print and nodded slowly. "Let them in." The 5 stepped inside a penthouse they'd never been allowed to set foot in, the luxury pressing in on them like a reminder of what they'd tried to steal and what they'd nearly lost for good. And when they saw Harold and Margaret on the sofa across the room, Jade pouring tea with careful hands and a gentle steadiness, something inside them snapped. Brandon moved first. He crossed the marble and dropped to his knees on the cold white floor, and the others followed like a chain breaking, all 5 kneeling, all 5 crying like they'd forgotten how to breathe. Brandon's words came out strangled. "Mom, Dad, we're the worst children on earth. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for throwing you out, for selling the house you grew up in, for caring about money more than everything you sacrificed for me." Chelsea sobbed until her makeup streaked. "We don't deserve to be your children. We betrayed the purest love there is. I hate myself for it." Tyler wiped at his face with shaking fingers. "I haven't been able to eat. I haven't been able to sleep since that night. Every time I close my eyes, I see your faces when we pushed you out." Amber's voice wobbled like it might shatter. "I dreamt you died from cold and hunger every night. I'm losing my mind." And Travis, the youngest, couldn't even get full sentences out. He just choked on his sobs, forcing the words through anyway. "Please, please give us one chance. Just one chance to prove we can change. We'll do anything to make it right." Harold and Margaret sat in silence, their old hands clasped together so tightly their knuckles blanched. Tears filled their eyes, but beneath the tears was a deep pain that didn't vanish just because apologies were finally being spoken. They looked at each other, speaking without words, weighing what mercy would cost them. Xavier stood at the window with his arms folded across his chest, his face unreadable, watching 5 siblings he'd only just learned existed. And inside him there was no forgiveness waiting, only a hard, cold refusal for anyone who had made his parents suffer. Jade rose from Margaret's side and moved toward Xavier, took his hand lightly, her voice soft in his ear. "Forgive them. It's what they need. And it's what your parents need too, if they're ever going to live without carrying this pain forever." Xavier shook his head once, his voice flat. "You're too kind, Jade. They don't deserve forgiveness after what they did." Jade's smile was small and sad. She looked into his eyes and spoke carefully, like she was laying a bandage over something that still bled. Because I know what it feels like to want forgiveness. I was Dimitri's wife. I lived under guilt, thinking I let my child die. If I hadn't learned to forgive myself and accept forgiveness from others, I wouldn't have survived to stand here today. Sometimes, forgiveness isn't because the other person deserves it. Sometimes it's because we need to let go so we can keep living. The silence stretched until it felt like the room itself was holding its breath. Then Margaret stood, slow and stiff, and walked toward her children who still knelt with bowed heads. Her voice trembled, but it carried a quiet authority that made every sound in the penthouse fall away. "Get up." All five lifted their faces. Hope and fear tangled together, and rose on unsteady legs. Margaret looked each of them in the eye, tears sliding down the lines of her age-worn face. "Your father and I have decided to forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because we're family, and family has to learn how to forgive." The five of them broke all at once, rushing forward, clinging to Harold and Margaret, crying like children who'd finally found their way home after getting lost on purpose. Harold stood too, wrapping his arms around them, his voice thick with grief and love. "We forgive you, but from now on you must learn to value family. You must be grateful for what you have. You must never let money and status blind you again. And most important, you must accept Xavier as your oldest brother, the son we lost for 38 years and have finally found again." The five turned toward Xavier, and for the first time they looked at him not with fear, but with shame and the fragile hunger to be accepted. Xavier didn't move. His face stayed cold. He didn't step closer. Jade reached for his hand and tugged gently. "They're your siblings. Even if you hate them, blood still ties you together." Xavier stared at her for a long moment, saw the sincerity in her eyes, and after a hesitation that felt like a battle inside his chest, he gave a small nod and let her pull him forward. Travis was the first one with the courage to step out of the group. He walked to Xavier and dropped to his knees again, voice shaking. "Brother, I'm sorry. For everything. For not knowing you existed. For hurting our parents so badly that you, the one who should have grown up with us, had to be the one to save them." Xavier looked down at him, saw real regret there, not a performance, and for the first time his voice softened by a fraction. "Stand up. If you really want forgiveness, prove it with what you do from this moment on, not with apologies." That night, after Harold and Margaret had gone to their room to rest with a sense of relief because they'd forgiven their children and found their firstborn again, after the five children, Brandon, Tyler, Chelsea, Amber, and Travis, had left the penthouse with a promise to return next weekend and prove through actions that they'd changed, the 45th floor penthouse sank into stillness, with only the faint sound of wind slipping through a crack in the door and Manhattan's shimmering lights outside casting soft, hazy streaks across the white marble floor. Jade stood in her small room, staring at the old suitcase she'd pulled from the closet, the few sets of clothes folded neatly inside, and her heart tightened as she realized it was time to leave, because her job was done. Harold and Margaret now had their real family to care for them, and she, Jade Amelia Winters, no longer had any reason to stay. She stepped out onto the balcony, hoping the cold air might dull the ache in her chest, but when she slid the glass door open, she saw Xavier already there, one hand resting on the railing, looking out over the city with a thoughtful, weighted expression, and when he heard her footsteps, he turned, his gaze no longer as icy as it used to be. Xavier watched Jade in silence for a long moment, then asked in a low voice edged with worry, "Will you stay?" A simple question carrying everything he didn't dare say out loud, and Jade felt her heart pinch harder, turning her face away because she couldn't bear to look at him. I've finished the work I was hired to do. Harold and Margaret have their real family now. Their 5 children will take care of them. They don't need me anymore. I think it's time I should go." Xavier moved closer with decisive steps and gripped Jade's shoulders, forcing her to turn back toward him, his blue eyes locking onto hers with a heat that felt like it could burn through anything. "You are family. Not them, not those 5 children, but you. You were with them when it was the hardest. You gave them love when nobody else did. And you've become my family too." Jade shook her head, tears starting to slide down her cold cheeks. "I'm just a paid helper. You don't need to feel responsible for me. I'll be fine. I've always survived." But Xavier didn't let go of her shoulders. Instead, he took both her hands, his voice softening but steady with determination. You're the only woman I want to be with. Not out of responsibility, not out of pity, but because I need you. Because when I'm with you, I don't feel completely alone anymore, because you understand me in a way nobody else can." Jade trembled, body and voice alike. "But my past, you know it. I was Dmitry Volkov's wife. I lived with your enemy. I'm not clean, not untouched. How can you want someone like me?" Xavier shook his head hard and pulled her closer until their breaths mingled. "The past doesn't matter, Jade. What matters is where you want to be from now on, how you want to live, and if it's possible, do you want to be with me?" Jade broke into sobs, months of bottled-up emotion spilling out all at once. "I want to be here. I want to be with you, but I don't deserve you. You're Xavier Sterling Knight. You can have any woman you want. Someone prettier, smarter, someone who doesn't carry a dark past like mine." Before she could finish, Xavier pressed a finger to her lips, silencing her, then rested his forehead against hers in a tenderness she never expected from him. "Don't ever say that again, Jade. You deserve every good thing in this world. You've endured too much, you've lost too much, and if anyone doesn't deserve anything, it's me. I'm a killer. I've got blood on my hands. I'm the man who indirectly caused your daughter's death. But even so, if you'll give me a chance, I'll spend my whole life protecting you, loving you, and making you happy." Jade looked up, her green eyes soaked with tears as they met Xavier's blue eyes that were no longer cold. And in that moment, in the winter wind of a Manhattan night, under the glittering lights of a city that never slept, Xavier slowly bent down and brushed his lips to hers in their first kiss, gentle as a butterfly settling, sweet as honey, carrying all the feelings that had been held back for so long between two lonely people who'd found each other in the dark. When they parted, they were both breathing unevenly, and Xavier pulled Jade tight against him, his face buried in her hair, whispering with a trembling voice, "Stay with me, Jade. Don't leave. I promise I won't let you suffer anymore. I'll protect you from every danger, and I'll love you until my last breath." And Jade held him back and nodded through tears of happiness, not needing to say anything, because her heart had already answered for her, that she'd stay, she'd be with this man, and together they'd build a new future on the foundation of a painful past. A future where real love could heal even the deepest wounds. 13 months later, when spring had arrived and cherry blossoms were blooming across New York on a warm, sunlit March morning, in Queens on the very street where Xavier first met Harold, Margaret, and Jade on that fateful rainy November night, a modern 5-story building of transparent glass architecture stood tall and radiant under the sunlight, crowned with a large golden sign that read, "The Lilly and Brennan Foundation." Hundreds of people attended the grand opening, their applause crashing like waves as Harold and Margaret, two elders aged 73 and 69 with faces glowing and no longer marked by the hardship of the past, cut the ribbon together. The first floor dedicated to a free care center for abandoned seniors with modern hospital beds and devoted nurses. The second and third floors serving as a safe shelter for abused women with counseling rooms and job training classes. The fourth and fifth floors, housing free legal consultation offices and a life skills training center. Jade stood on the stage in an elegant blue suit as the executive director, her voice carrying through the microphone. This charity was born from pain and love, from people who have suffered and now want to help others who are suffering. We understand because we've been there, and we promise we won't let anyone feel as lonely and abandoned as we once did. And Travis, the youngest brother, his face no longer gaunt with the weight of guilt, stepped up as a full-time volunteer and said, through a tight, trembling voice, "I want to make amends by helping others, by doing what I didn't do for my parents when they needed it most." While Xavier stood in the last row, with a faint smile appearing on his lips for the first time, watching his family and the woman he loved turn a dream into something real. 3 months later, on a June afternoon as the sun sank low, Xavier led Jade back to the same dark Queens alley where they first met. Jade asked in confusion, "Why are you bringing me here?" And Xavier smiled, "Because this is where my life changed, where I found my parents and the love of my life." Then he dropped to one knee on the sidewalk that had once been bitterly cold and now felt warm beneath the amber sunset, reached into his coat pocket, and pulled out a small red velvet box, opening it to reveal a 3-carat diamond ring glittering under the streetlight that had just flickered on. "Jade Amelia Winters, you saved my parents when you were still sinking in your own darkness. You taught me how to love when all I knew was hate. You're the light in my dark world. Will you be my wife?" Will you stay with me for the rest of this life?" And Jade sobbed and nodded, unable to form a single word. Letting Xavier rise, slide the ring onto her finger, and pull her into his arms with a sweet, breathless kiss in the very alley that had once witnessed their pain and now bore witness to their love. After 3 months of preparation, with the help of Harold, Margaret, and all 5 siblings who had changed, on September 9th, the wedding was held at St. Patrick Cathedral in the heart of Manhattan with 50 close guests. Not extravagant, but overflowing with love. Harold trembled as he walked Jade down the red-carpeted aisle, lined with white roses on both sides, and whispered, "My daughter, I'll never forget what you did for this family. You saved both me and your mother, and now you'll bring happiness to our son." Jade held his shaking hand and looked toward the altar, where Xavier waited in a black Tom Ford suit, his eyes fixed on her with a wordless devotion. Margaret sat in the front row, wiping tears of joy, and when Jade reached the altar, the priest asked for their vows. Xavier took Jade's hands and said, "You gave me a family. You gave me a reason to live. I swear I'll protect you from every darkness, love you in every circumstance, and spend my whole life becoming worthy of you." And Jade wept as she answered, "You saved me from hell. You gave me hope when I thought there was nothing left. You're the greatest gift God has given me. I'll stay with you forever." They exchanged rings, and Margaret stood to present an old worn gold wedding band Xavier had recovered from the original buyer after months of searching. "This is the ring I once sold to raise my children. Now I'm giving it to my daughter-in-law." The 5 siblings, Brandon, Tyler, Chelsea, Amber, and Travis, stepped up and said, "You did what we couldn't. We're sorry. And thank you for loving our brother." The priest declared, "I pronounce you husband and wife. The groom may kiss the bride." And Xavier pulled Jade into his arms and kissed her deeply amid thunderous applause. And for the first time in 38 years, Xavier's sterling night felt complete. This story shows us that sometimes the people we lose return in ways no one could ever expect. That real family isn't defined by blood or lineage, but by the ones willing to stay when life is at its hardest. That true love always finds its way home, no matter how much pain and darkness it has to cross. And most importantly, it's never too late to forgive, to love, and to begin again. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and share this video so more people can listen to moving and meaningful stories every day, because every story we bring you isn't only for entertainment. It's also a reminder of what truly matters in life: family love, gratitude, and the strength of forgiveness. Tell us how you feel about this story. Did it make you think of your parents, your family, or the people who helped you when you needed it most? Have you ever faced betrayal or loss like Harold and Margaret, or found love in an unexpected place like Xavier and Jade? We'd truly love to hear what's in your heart in the comments below, because your story matters, and it might inspire someone else who's reading. Finally, thank you sincerely for giving your precious time to follow this story from beginning to end. We wish you and your family good health, a life filled with joy and laughter, smooth days at work, a love that stays full and steady, and most of all, please cherish the people you love while they're still beside you. Because life is short. We never know what tomorrow holds, so love them with everything you have while you can. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video with another moving story. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you won't miss it. We love you all so much.